Researching history is like a puzzle. You find an interesting piece of information, or what you're being told is a piece of information, and you want to know more about it. Verify it. But then, to fully understand it, you have to find out what led to it. And then you read about what happened because of it. And now you've got 3 pieces. Pieces of a billion-piece puzzle. Otherwise, that small piece by itself doesn't matter much. I could say that Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland, was given a posthumous execution. But other than an odd turn of phrase, doesn't really explain events. It would be like opening a book in the 3rd quarter of it and just taking it as it is. So, we're going to look at puzzle pieces after the death of Asa Harmon McCoy, because history doesn't happen in a vacuum. Welcome to this episode of This Famous Vendetta. I'm your host, Jason Hatfield. Welcome. Some years ago, my wife and I had a dog named Kennedy. She was a special dog, as they all are, and we loved her tremendously. She always had some kind of elusive quality that everyone could observe, but nobody could actually describe. She was stubborn, she was a princess, she was feisty, and she was highly motivated by food. She had big ears and a distinctive forehead. Always believing that she had some pit bull in her, I came across a book by a local author named Brownman Dickey called Pit Bull. I picked it up and began to read it. Early in the 2nd chapter, she references an old house in New York City, the 3rd oldest in the city, built around the middle of the 18th century. But after having traded hands by around 1863, it became a sportsman's hall in which the 1st floor housed a pit where all kinds of events took place, including dogfighting. Well, after getting over the nauseating concept of dogfighting in and of itself, I wondered what sort of events took place in that time. I mean, we know about the Civil War during the time of the dogfighting, and we might know some things about the Revolutionary War, about the time the building was built, but what happened in the interim of those events and after? What did that house observe in its time? This led me to my nerdathon. About 10 years ago, while reading Dickey's book, I wanted to know about all of those pieces that fit together between stories. I had a lot of books, and I thought, as many of us do with a favorite series like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, I'd like to go through the history in a linear fashion. So, I started a nerdathon. It was a decision to read my books, watch my movies, and play any historically based video games, all in chronological order by content. Probably one of the dorkiest things I've ever done. Well, maybe? Yeah, we'll just say yes. I started around the mid-1500s in Japanese history just because it was the Sengoku Jidai, or the period of warring states, and I already knew a great deal about the Spanish explorations through the writings of Columbus and Bartolomé de las Casas, as well as some others, and bouncing back and forth between Japanese and American history, I've now gotten to about 1895. In 10 years. It's been a fascinating experience, and it's layered the different places and people working to accomplish things or against each other in a more consequential fashion. I've experienced the heat of a mountain on fire as Oda Nobunaga's troops burned Mount Hiei, killing thousands of people in retaliation for allying against him in 1571. I crawled through the snow with Roger Williams trying to escape his capture by Puritans angered by his teaching of religious tolerance in 1631. I witnessed half-kings split the skull of a French officer in front of George Washington during a ceasefire in May of 1754, and pondered the fact that a severed head found in a chimney is tied to the naming of the state of North Carolina. It certainly helped me as a teacher believe it or not. However, I've also been forced to learn about things I ordinarily wouldn't have had interest in. For example, I really dreaded the lead up to the Civil War. As I've said before, living in the South, there's just something about it that is difficult for me to admire. And yet, the conflicting components of it are everywhere. Heroic monuments to the fallen, Confederate flags flying outside of homes, and even reenactments of lost battles. But since the next event to happen in the ongoing feud we're discussing isn't for a few years, I thought, we'd take a step away and discuss the end of this other conflict of which, surprisingly, I've developed a healthy respect and appreciation for. For this episode, I wanted to evaluate the events following the death of Asa Harmon McCoy and the months coming to the end of the Civil War, a war that I feel has perhaps lost its gravity in the past 161 years since its end. After all, we repeatedly hear about people believing we are headed for another set of internal hostilities of such magnitude without really understanding its nature or consequence. I mean, in the South, for example, there's this belief that, should we head towards another civil war, we'll do better this time, which is a shocking perspective to have, honestly. I mean, why would you or anyone want a round two of it? And this conflict isn't so much regional as it is ideological. Who has the most American values? As we progress through my family's history, I think there's a good chance that we'll really evaluate the question of whether or not violence solves really anything. Well, in the last episode, we did talk about the death of Asa Harmon McCoy in January of 1865. I don't want to simply do a hard cut to the next event in the feud. I want to provide some sort of context between events, things that happened here and elsewhere, and give a broader perspective to history. A few things happen after Asa's death at the hands of, either Jim Vance or Jim Wheeler Wilson, depending on the version. First, the war will come to an end, and let me set the scene. Asa Harmon McCoy dies, and within weeks, the 13th Amendment is debated and passed. Within weeks, abolishing slavery in the country at last. Meanwhile, the South is collapsing, and they are looking for any sort of Hail Mary to turn the tide. The Union decides to attack a major railway hub south of Richmond in a place called Petersburg and turns into a Union siege that lasts 292 days, further damaging Lee's supply lines. The siege proves to be too much, and the Confederacy retreats, setting fire to anything of military value in Richmond, which itself will catch on fire as a breeze kicks up and the local fire brigades are unable to keep up with the spread of that fire. So the capital of the Confederacy burns. The president, Jefferson Davis, is on the run. And Confederate General Robert E. Lee understands his position cannot be held and withdraws southwest. He's desperately low on supplies and hopes he can connect with Joseph Johnston's troops that are in North Carolina, his only hope for salvation at this point. Now, Ulysses S. Grant, general of the Union forces in this theater, is in pursuit. If Lee is able to escape, the war will grind on. This cannot happen. After the Pyrrhic victory the Union had at Antietam, with Lee able to slip away, the North absolutely feels that this cannot continue any longer than it has to. As a side note, I've gotten to really love the term Pyrrhic victory. The term comes from a king of Epirus named Pyrrhus, who won costly victories against the Romans. It has come to since be considered a strategic victory, but at such a cost that you can't win many more like it due to such heavy losses. Now, Antietam was one such victory, and Lee was able to slip away from Maryland back into Virginia, dragging the Civil War on. Now, back to 1865, after Lee's retreat from Richmond, Union forces pursue Lee to a place near Appomattox Courthouse, and he is faced with three choices: fight it out, disband the army and continue the fight through guerrilla warfare, or surrender to Grant. Well, he and his officers confer, and they choose to fight. At first, it goes well for the South, until the Confederates understand that the small Union contingent they are fighting are not the entire force. What they are actually facing are Lee's collective 26,000 troops outnumbered by over 2-1 by these Union forces. Once they realize there is no support available, as the nearest army is at least 3 miles away, the decision is made, and not lightly, to surrender. Arrangements are made, and they meet at a farmhouse owned by Wilmer McLean at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th of 1865, and terms for surrender are drawn up and agreed to. This is a strange coincidence because the first land battle to occur in the Civil War was at a place called Manassas, Virginia, on McLean's farm 4 years prior, that same Wilmer McLean. So he had served with the Virginia militia, but McLean felt he was too old to enlist in this war. And after this first battle known as First Manassas, as there would be a second Manassas, McLean wanted to place space between his family and the war and moved 120 miles south, where years later, the war would end in his parlor. Crazy. Almost a week after Lee's surrender, Washington, D.C. is jubilant about the ending of the war. On April 11th, Lincoln gave a speech saying that, along with emancipation, maybe it was time to give certain African Americans the right to vote. It was bad enough that he had released the slaves, but voting was the bridge too far for one man, John Wilkes Booth. On Good Friday, April 14th, Booth is at Ford's Theater checking his mail, which had been afforded him as a courtesy by the theater's owner, and he's told Lincoln would be attending the show that night. And he gets his compatriots together and plans one of the most shocking assassinations in U.S. history. But it wasn't his first attempt at an attack on Lincoln. In fact, sometime earlier, Booth had made a plan to kidnap the president, take him to Richmond, and ransom him for the release of Confederates held in Union stockades. But a change in Lincoln's plans left the kidnappers in the wrong place. The plans for this kidnapping were devised in a boarding house run by a widow named Mary Surratt, whose son Booth had become friends with. Now, this boarding house was also in Washington, D.C. That boarding house is still standing and now serves as a Chinese restaurant. Again, you never know the memory in some places, even Chinese restaurants. A few years ago, some good friends of mine and I ate at that restaurant during a teacher conference with the White House Historical Association. And I'll leave it at that. Though it was strange to eat egg rolls in a location where such famous people planned a thwarted kidnapping. At any rate, knowing Lincoln's entertainment plans, Booth changes course. That evening, while the Lincolns and their two guests watch a production of Our American Cousin from up above in the presidential box, Booth puts his plan into motion, and Lincoln is shot in the back of the head. Now, to be honest, Booth's plan is genius. There is nobody else that could have pulled this off in the manner he did. He was a famous actor, attending a high-profile performance in a theater in Washington, D.C. Booth enters the theater, goes to the mezzanine, gets Lincoln's valet to let him into the presidential box. Now, between this door and the actual box is a small vestibule. Booth bolts the outer door shut in this vestibule with a piece of wood he'd left earlier in the day and had managed to make a peephole to figure out his plan of attack. He was more than familiar with the play, and he waits for the line, "You sockdologizing old man trap," for the audience to laugh so that their laughter can cover the gunshot. So let me just say that again. "You sockdologizing old man trap." Now, that's an insult you don't hear very often. In fact, I think it should make a full comeback, honestly. Full disclosure, I know that line so well because I said that line in a film about not so much the assassination of Lincoln, but I was involved in the scene in which he was shot. It's supposed to be an insult to the woman it is aimed at, as she has shown herself to be a gold digger and wanting a marriage of financial security. I played the character of Asa Trenchard, who was actually played by Harry Hawk, who said the line Booth waited for. The film I was in was actually about the trial of Mary Surratt, who ran the boarding house turned Chinese restaurant where Booth and others met to plan Lincoln's kidnapping. Well, after the assassination, that building's owner, Mary Surratt, and some of her son's other compatriots will be arrested, put on trial, found guilty, and hanged for their part in the conspiracy. Surratt will be the first woman executed by the federal government. The film, by the way, was shot in Savannah, Georgia, and I'll just tell you, it's called The Conspirator, and it was directed by the late, great Robert Redford, who just passed last year. He was an all-star. I loved meeting him and trying my best to get over the fact that he played Roy Hobbs. One scene, shot at a church, happened to be next door to one of William T. Sherman's headquarters after his march to the sea. So strange how it all kind of ties together. Well, in the film, after his assassination, soldiers carry Lincoln's body out of Ford's Theater. There's confusion, there's shock, and Redford's treatment of Lincoln is almost that of a fallen hero. And I have to say, I don't believe I've ever given Abraham Lincoln the credit he really does deserve. I mean, yes, you can see monuments and statues and coins and all kinds of regalia, but why exactly was he so important? I mean, yes, he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. Yes, he wrote the Gettysburg Address. Yes, he came from humble beginnings, but take a moment to truly imagine being president, and almost immediately states secede. Regardless of your campaigning, regardless of your victory, which wasn't a landslide, by the way, you're a man. You're a man from humble beginnings, and your nation is tearing itself apart. Shots are fired. A rebellion is underway. What are you going to do? Lincoln has so many things that he's having to grapple with. The secession of states, the fate of slavery in this country, which had been debated since the nation's founding, and walking a thin line between what he wants to do and, this is the staggering part, what he is constitutionally able to do. Our Constitution is the rule book for how government is supposed to work. We designed it after the Revolution, and so many things that we felt strongly about protecting and avoiding, we placed in that document. Right to bear arms. It's in there because the British were trying to seize our guns in Concord, Massachusetts. If the government has the guns, then there's not a lot that people can do in defense. Now, this is a controversial amendment today for lots of different reasons, but the reason behind it being in the Constitution is from that act. But the first and longest article in the Constitution is the one establishing the legislative body, and the second article is the office of the president. So the legislative body was considered more important than the president. We didn't want an overly powerful president at all. In fact, the first draft of sorts of the Constitution was the Articles of Confederation, and there was no other branch but the legislative, because we saw a man wield too much power from it, King George III. So most of the powers are invested in the Congress and not the president. And I saw that because during the Civil War, Lincoln could have gone above and beyond what his powers were, all in an effort to keep the country together and punish those who had led us down this path. It probably could have been easy to fall prey to, but he didn't. He was in an unprecedented scenario with unimaginable struggles, one after the other. He could have abused that power, that authority, and done whatever he needed to win this conflict. Let me specify, it's not like he did nothing controversial. He did. He took away the right of people to challenge their imprisonment, the legal term being habeas corpus, but the South did that too. And while on that same White House Historical Association Teacher Institute I mentioned earlier, I met a woman of Lakota descent. And while we were touring the Blair House, we entered the Lincoln Room, where Lincoln frequently consulted with the Blairs. It is heavily decorated in Lincoln. And this teacher looked uncomfortable. And so I asked her what was wrong, and she expressed that she's not a huge fan of Lincoln. And this is when I found I had possibly overly simplified the view of the man at that time. Because she told me that he had ordered the execution of 38 Lakota all at the same time. Well, I had never heard of this, and it led me to do some research. And it goes pretty much as you might imagine. Lakota were forced onto a reservation and were promised supplies in exchange for, giving up a nomadic existence. And because of corruption, Those who were supposed to supply these Lakota with these supplies were selling those supplies to make money, and the Lakota were starving. So they lashed out to get food and also in anger. Well, by the time this little skirmish was put down, over 300 Lakota had been tried and found guilty. Now, Lincoln would say that, quote, anxious to not act with so much clemency as to encourage another outbreak on one hand, nor with so much severity as to be real cruelty on the other, I ordered a careful examination of the records of the trials to be made, end quote. And he reduced the number to be executed to 38. 300 to 38. But that's still a lot. And it's the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Not sure if justice was done. And in one of the Lincoln biographies I read, there's only one sentence dedicated to this event. I'm not even sure if the merchants involved were even punished. But that was in 1862. So, like with all history, things are complicated. I've always heard the term absolute power corrupts absolutely, and the true measure of an individual is how he treats a person who can do him absolutely no good. Lincoln, at least from what I've read, is a biography by Ronald White, Ways and Means, which I talked about before, a Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin. Lincoln understands the war will eventually end. What will happen in the country after that war? How will his actions impact the nation and its deep divisions? Make them better? Make them worse? Let me give you an example. What he's best known for is his freeing of the slaves. As mentioned before, he had written the Emancipation Proclamation, which didn't actually free any slaves and only applied to states that were in open rebellion. There were 3 states that stayed with the Union but allowed slavery. If Lincoln attacked slavery altogether during this conflict, he would run the risk of losing the states loyal to the Union that still had that slavery. Missouri, who was already struggling to stay on board, Kentucky, and Maryland, who was also not exactly a shining example. Now, how are you going to win the war, free the enslaved, but not widen the scope of the conflict, potentially making it unwinnable? Plus, how can the government take away people's property when the Constitution says in its Fifth Amendment you cannot deprive people of life, liberty, or property without due process of law? Now, enslaved individuals were considered property, and believe me, I know how absolutely insane that sounds today, but even the Dred Scott decision established that slaves were not people. And in the Constitution, they were considered only 3/5 of a person, and at the beginning, Lincoln wasn't running on an abolitionist platform. In fact, he was willing to let slavery exist where it already was. He just didn't want it to expand into the new territories that had yet to become states. If Lincoln decided to simply let them all be free, then constitutionally, he would be taking more power than he was given by the Constitution. And he knew that. Plus, if the enslaved were freed, wouldn't the U.S. government have to compensate every single slave owner? Plus, certain war powers he is given weren't exactly clear. And either you had to treat those rebelling, the Confederates, as U.S. citizens, which they were, even if they were claiming to have successfully seceded to form a different country, or treat them as a foreign combatant, in which you would be able to have your military act a little differently, but then you'd accept that they had successfully seceded. It gets really philosophical in its handling of civics, and that, I find, was probably the most fascinating part. He could have just, tried to write an executive order and said it was done. After all, desperate times call for desperate measures. But that could have also upset members of Congress that maybe didn't care about the liberation of the slaves, but just wanted an end to the war. And when the 13th Amendment came up, it caused issues. Because why pass such an amendment if the South was seeking a cessation of the war, as they were doing at that time? If the passing of the amendment would complicate them willing to stop the war, then why have it? And if they were going to surrender anyway, then why have it? Because Lincoln knew it had been a thorn in our side for far too long, and it needed to be finally dealt with. An executive order could have possibly done that, but probably not also. Congress makes the laws. Congress would have to make that law. By the way, Lincoln only wrote about 48 executive orders in his just over 4 years as president. By comparison, our current president, Donald Trump, has been in office for a little over a year and has signed 248 executive orders in this term alone. But he's not written the most. That title goes to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with a grand total of 3,726 executive orders, but he also won 4 terms, dying just into his last term. Prior to him, there was no law restricting how long a president could stay in office. And after his 4th, Republicans thought that maybe it would be a time to slap a limit on that. Well, anyway, Congress would pass that law, the 13th Amendment. The voice of the people would make that happen, and the issue would at least officially be resolved. And Lincoln's maneuvering was brilliant. You have to accept that, especially given how little education he had growing up. But there would be issues with people enslaved for generations now simply being free. I mean, how does that work? Many can't read since educating slaves had been outlawed since Nat Turner's rebellion, where, he believed God had told him to rise up and kill his enslavers and the ones next door, and the ones next door to them until he and his followers were stopped. The enslaved also didn't own property and were still seen as not having rights, which would bring about the 14th Amendment, which is my personal favorite. In an effort to protect those formerly enslaved from any encroachment of their rights as Americans, the 14th granted equal protection, citizenship, and another articulation of due process protections. It's truly a beautiful amendment, but that won't be ratified until 1868, having been passed in 1866. And Lincoln's desire for enfranchisement of those formerly enslaved would also eventually come about with the 15th Amendment. Lincoln could have abused his powers and made it to some degree easier to wage a war, but perhaps create greater issues for after. A dictator bringing about the heavy hand of tyranny. But however frustrating it was, he stayed his course, played his chess, and was still able to accomplish his goals through legitimate means. I have serious respect for that. So with all of that work, all of that effort, all of that exhaustion, then he shot and killed. That's just truly a tragedy for the ages. And his assassin, Booth, felt that he would be championed a hero for killing Lincoln. But quite the opposite happened. The South was now in a tense situation because Booth potentially created a great deal more strife for them after all of the destruction that had already occurred. He'll die, shot in a burning barn. But this strife that he's created for the South and this struggle carries over to North Carolina. Now, meanwhile, in that state, not all the Confederate troops had surrendered. Now, this is after Appomattox. This is after the assassination of Lincoln. And a rail line was being finished to Raleigh, North Carolina, and William Tecumseh Sherman was on his way to establish his base of operations there to press the campaign on the remaining forces here. The troops that Lee had planned to meet, those of Joseph Johnston, were now quite uncertain as to what to do. Johnston more than understood that their numbers and leadership were dwindling, their supplies all but gone, and Sherman was to go after them. After his showing in his march across Georgia, burning everything in his path, Johnston saw what his cards were. The governor of North Carolina, Zebulon Vance, was already asking for protection for the citizens of Raleigh and was trying to flee to prevent being arrested himself. Then a package had come from Johnston to Sherman by way of Durham Station. It had come under a flag of truce. Now, strangely enough, after reading Johnston's request for a cessation of hostilities to engage in arrangements to terminate the existing war, as it was put, Sherman sent his aide-de-camp, a Colonel McCoy, with his response agreeing to meet. No idea at all about his relations to the overall story of this podcast. Sherman receives a message from Johnston that he's willing to meet the following day. Sherman ordered a car and locomotive to take him to Durham, and when he and his staff got on board, he received a telegraph that Lincoln had been assassinated. Secretary of State William Seward had been attacked as well in that same plan of Booth's. It was larger in scale than many of us were taught. This was a horrific turn of events. If word got out down here that it had happened, would that embolden Johnston? Would he refuse to surrender? Was this a strike for victory? Was this a ploy? Was this a broader strategy perpetrated by the remnants of the Confederacy? Not to mention that this was the first time a president of the United States had been assassinated. I mean, it must have appeared that anything could possibly happen. Well, Sherman's got a lot on his mind. He gets to Durham by 10 a.m. on April the 17th, and a Union cavalry unit was there to escort him. They send a rider ahead with a platoon under a white flag, and Sherman with his cavalry follow. When a rider from Johnston approaches, and they say that a small farmhouse had been approached as a meeting place for these negotiations. When the parties arrived, Mr. James Bennett and his family withdrew to a smaller cabin after giving the men permission to meet in their home. As soon as Sherman and Johnston were alone, Sherman informed him of the news about Lincoln's death. Sherman said he watched him closely, and he writes, quote, "The perspiration came out in large drops on his forehead, and he did not attempt to conceal his distress. He denounced the act as a disgrace to the age and hoped I did not charge it to the Confederate government. I told him I could not believe that he or General Lee or the officers of the Confederate Army could possibly be privy to acts of assassination. But I would not say as much for Jeff Davis, George Sanders, and men of that stripe. We talked about the effect of this act on the country at large and on the armies, and he realized that it made my situation extremely delicate. I explained to him that I had not yet revealed the news to my own personal staff or to the Army, and that I dreaded the effect when made known in Raleigh. Mr. Lincoln was peculiarly endeared to the soldiers, and I feared that some foolish man or woman in Raleigh might say something or do something that would madden our men, and that a fate worse than that of Columbia would befall the place." End quote. I mean, that's a pretty tense, amazing situation. Well, the negotiations for peace would last for days, including a revising of the terms Sherman had helped create. Washington wants to revise them and would impact Confederates in 4 different states, totaling almost 90,000 men. Now, for Durham, this pause for peace would dramatically shift its destiny. As there was a ceasefire, the men from both sides took liberties on the tobacco warehouses, especially those of J.R. Greene, whose stores were almost completely emptied, and not by lawful purchases either. He knew his business was ruined. Well, meanwhile, the negotiations at the Bennett farm were finalized later that month, and the war was over. The men of the war went back to their homes and began sending letters back to Durham Station requesting more of the bright leaf tobacco, a process of curing the tobacco with heat, creating a milder product, I suppose. I don't smoke, but I've seen the demonstration at the North Carolina State Fair. It's pretty neat. But it was enough. Thousands of orders came in, and Greene realized he wasn't ruined after all. In fact, he was now big into business. But now he needed a brand. He met an associate named James Whitted and was, as the story goes, having lunch over oysters. What was the brand to be? And that's when they saw the jar of Coleman's mustard on the table with the bull's head on the label. Bull Durham Tobacco was born and boomed. Now, Durham is known as the Bull City, and our minor league baseball team, that rocks, by the way, is also known as the Durham Bulls. And there was even a movie made concerning the team called Bull Durham. So, because of a jar of mustard. And what if they had been eating Planters peanuts or something? Who knows? Well, eventually the Duke family would buy up tobacco production in the city, create a monopoly, and Durham would be known for decades for its tobacco production. There was also the process of Reconstruction beginning in the South and the Industrial Revolution of industries that arose from the Civil War that would lead to what we refer to as the Gilded Age. But, at least for this episode, the Civil War is over and life somehow has to come back to normal. The quote from Frodo at the end of Return of the King comes to mind. How do you pick up the threads of an old life? How do you go on when in your heart you begin to understand there is no going back? Well, we'll see how the two families return to some degree of normalcy after the conflict in our next episode of this famous vendetta. Thanks for listening, and as always, like, share, subscribe, and reach out to us. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Follow us on all three. Now go out there and make history in a good way. Until next time.